Good morning. Thank you for joining us. My name is Nan Brandon. I'm the genealogist upstairs in the reference room. And it's a pleasure for me to welcome you to the library today. Before you leave, if you could give us a response on the little papers I left around, that helps us to know what programs you are interested in and what you would like in the future. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Janet Allured. Dr. Janet Allured received her PhD from the University of Arkansas in 1988. In 2021, she retired as Professor of History and Women's Studies at McNeese State University in Lake Charles, Louisiana, and is currently serving as Adjunct Professor of History at the University of Arkansas. Allured has authored numerous peer-reviewed articles on Southern women and has co-edited several volumes, including Louisiana Women, Their Lives and Times, and a monograph entitled Remapping Second Wave Feminism. She is currently writing several manuscripts about the work of progressive Methodist women in the South, and with a particular focus on anti-racism and settlement housework. An essay about Theressa Hoover, head of the United Methodist Women from 1968 to 1990, was recently published in an edited collection, Activism in the Name of God, by the University of Mississippi Press. Today, she will be discussing with you the life and legacy of Theressa Hoover. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Janet Allured.
Thank you so much. I'm very pleased to be here and be given this opportunity to talk about one of my heroines, who is Theressa. I think she said Theressa, so I'll say it that way, but I also think she put up with people saying it different ways too. So let me get back here to my slideshow. I can also move it a little bit. Is that better? Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you. And let me just say that I welcome feedback on this, even though I have one article that's published on her already, that's already out. And if anybody wants information on that book, I have flyers for it. I can give you. But I'm still working on kind of the larger project of which this is a part, and I welcome suggestions and feedback from people, especially any of you who may have known her or people who did know her. I'm still looking for those contacts, to make those contacts here in Fayetteville. I'm sort of plumbing some contacts right now, but there's plenty of time for me to do that. So if anyone has suggestions, I'm happy to hear that. So let me just go ahead and launch in here. For Theressa Hoover, the Women's Division of the Board of Global Missions of the United Methodist Church and feminist theology were profoundly freeing. The Methodist Church's doctrines, creeds, practices, and policies provided opportunities for Hoover to become a nationally significant African-American feminist trailblazer, public intellectual, lay theologian, and progressive change maker. And I do want to make the point right at the outset that she is a lay woman, as we'll see, and as you saw by the dates of her life. Women don't get the right to ordination in the Methodist Church until 1956, and a lot of her work precedes that, so she comes in as a lay woman and considers lay women the importance. She considers the work of lay people, but especially lay women, extremely important to the life of the church, to the work of the church. So she's not ordained, which is why I make that point, that she's a lay theologian. But she's definitely a nationally significant figure, really internationally significant figure, and I'm working now with the Historic Commission to hopefully get a plaque to honor her memory, which is part of what I'm doing here as well. So that's a picture of her in her young life. I will show you her career at a glance. Don't worry, I'm not going to quiz you on this. And I will also come back to it because it's a lot. But as you can see here, when I get to that slide at the end there, in 1968, as she mentioned a minute ago, Hoover became Deputy General Secretary of the Women's Division of the Board of Global Missions, which is now Ministries of the United Methodist Church. And in 1973, she became the CEO of the United Methodist Women, or UMW, which is now United Women in Faith, giving her the distinction of attaining the highest executive position ever held by an African-American female in any mainline denomination in the country. So you can see why I think she's worthy of having this commemorative plaque. In 1971, Ladies' Home Journal named her one of America's most important 75 women. Universally well-liked by those who worked with her, her co-workers described her as whip-smart, tough but fair, someone who promoted racial justice fiercely and advocated just as fiercely for women and children internationally. She was unafraid to speak truth to power, but did so with grace, compassion, and respect. By the way, it took me about 2 years to figure out this one slide here because there are several mergers that the church goes through that it took me a long time to figure out, and the names change over time. So don't be confused by that. But if you want more information, if you want me to get into the weeds, I can help with that. The Women's Division, let me say, though, was the policy-making body for the Women's Society of Christian Service, which also changes names and becomes the UMW later in 1968. That is a lay woman's missionary organization. At the time that she took over in 1968, it had about 1.7 million members. It was the largest organization of women in the world. And it was also the oldest continuously existing single-sex women's organization in the world. It was the most autonomous. It has several distinctions. It was also the most autonomous among Christian denominations, women's divisions that is, controlling its own money and electing its own leadership, which again, I can wax eloquent about that if you want to know more. I'll leave some time for questions at the end. As CEO of essentially what was an enormous corporation, Hoover worked to overturn racial and gender discrimination in both church and society. She presided over the merger of the church and the women's division that ended segregation in the UMC. That happens between 1968 and 1972. Under her guidance, members of the UMW across the nation supported the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA, and one of the first religious groups to do that. They supported that, reproductive rights, and other goals of second-wave feminism, which is the post-war feminist movement. She racked up quite a number of honors, one of those being that she is the only woman for whom a Methodist church has been named, which I'll come back to that. That's Theressa Hoover, United Methodist Church in Little Rock, chartered in 1981. She was a political progressive and an activist Christian, a firebrand, a principled leader with, as she said, a healthy ego, for which I make no apologies. She retired in 1990 and stayed in New York, which is where the offices were, for another decade. In the early 2000s, she moved back to Fayetteville to be with family. Her health was beginning to fail. She never married. She attended Mount Sequoyah United Methodist Church on Old Wire Road instead of her home church of St. James, because St. James had always been very small, but more importantly for her, did not have an active UMW chapter, and Mount Sequoyah did at that point. She was inducted into the Arkansas Black Hall of Fame, and in 2008, the mayor proclaimed May 30th, 2008 as Theressa Hoover Day. Those are great honors and accomplishments, but I still want something people can read, a physical reminder of her importance and her significance, and she's a native of this town. When she died in December 2013, leading Methodists came from all over the world to attend her funeral. Reverend Sarah Pear, who still pastors that church, Mount Sequoyah, presided over her funeral. Another memorial service was held in 2014 at the Interchurch Center Chapel on Riverside Drive, which is where the church's headquarters were. Hoover chose to be buried in the segregated section of the old cemetery, which is Oaks, next to her father, and her sister is also buried in that same section. So Hoover was a pivotal mid-century bridge figure in American religion, in part because the church her family attended, St. James, which you may all know this, I know you're well-educated people, was part of the Methodist Episcopal Church, or the Northern congregation. It's the oldest MEC congregation in Arkansas. She taught Sunday school there, her first position of leadership in that church. St. James remained MEC until the merger with the MECS in 1939. That's one of those mergers, when Hoover was a teenager. She therefore grew up in an overwhelmingly white, though segregated, denomination that was at least somewhat less racist than most religious groups in the South. This experience led her to hope that challenging racism in the United States was a worthwhile endeavor, meaning she worked with white people, and particularly white women, some of whom protested racial segregation right along with her. By the way, Fayetteville's black population in 1954, when Fayetteville began integrating its school, was about 400 people, so relatively small. A bit about her personal background. Her grandfather, her father's stepfather, was a circuit-riding Methodist minister. So she comes from a long line of devoutly Methodist people. She said in an interview, only he was a circuit walker. It was nothing for Grandpa to walk 200 miles to his appointments because, of course, the black segments of the church were always terribly under-resourced. So he doesn't even have a horse to help him with that mission. Her father, James Hoover, a World War I veteran with a 6th grade education. There's the historic plaque of St. James. I meant to flip to that a minute ago. There's a picture of her father. Was a formative influence on her life. Hoover described her father as a strong, kind, gentle, and dignified man who always opened the door of his home to anyone in need. Her father was the chief maintenance and grounds man at City Hospital. By the way, I looked it up in the census. I'll go to that in a second. And they listed him as a janitor, although he was really much more than that. He spent most of his day attending to electrical and plumbing repairs, but sometimes he was called upon to help in surgery and even set broken bones. And later, the hospital paid tribute to him by naming a wing after him. Both her mother, Rissy Vaughn Hoover, who died when she was 2, and her stepmother, Edith, were domestics, very common, of course, for black women at the time. There were 4 children with the first wife and a 5th with the second. The family lived at 426 South Willow. That's the area which is currently, they're working to get that to become a historic district in Fayetteville. And the family did own that property, which again, Fayetteville's a little unusual in allowing that. Though the family had little money, they did have middle-class values that included a strong appreciation for education, very typical of Methodists. She said, it was just understood that we were going to go to high school and college. But Fayetteville had no high school for African Americans at the time. So she and 3 of her siblings, along with many others in the community, went to elsewhere to high school. She went to live with an aunt, her father's sister, in a small East Texas town where they could attend the high school where that aunt taught. And she graduated at the top of her class in 1942. From those humble beginnings, what led to Hoover's remarkable success was her Methodist belief system and connections to Methodist-affiliated institutions in her home state. For Methodists, the purpose of gaining knowledge was to prepare for a life of service. And her years at Philander Smith in Little Rock prepared her for this exceptionally well. That's an older picture of Philander Smith from the 1950s. She was the only person in her family, by the way, to go to, and this is, of course, a Methodist-supported school, which was originally established to train black preachers, because originally when the MEC was moved into the South and began establishing congregations, the preachers were all white, because the black members didn't have that training available to them. So that's why Philander Smith was set up. Anyway, she was the only one to go there, and she mentioned in an interview that was costly to her father to do that. So he clearly saw something in her that he was willing to pay for this education for her. And, you know, they tried to make it affordable at schools like this, but nonetheless, that's still something of a hardship for African Americans who never were paid, you know, sufficiently. All right, she attended during World War II, and classmates who went into service, of course, the men are then getting called into service, wrote back about things she had never seen or even imagined. That blacks and whites could work together amicably with mutual respect, because the black soldiers found a very different environment when they went over to Europe. While at Philander Smith, she joined Delta Sigma Theta, a sorority that emphasized community service as well as scholarship. And she was active in the Methodist Student Organization as well as the Student Christian Association, which was the YW and YMCA on campus. And both of those organizations, by the way, were among the most progressive organizations in the country at the time. The National YWC was perhaps the first organization to develop interracial initiatives in the South in the 1910s and 20s. Elected president of her class her junior and senior year, she clearly had leadership skills. Her senior year, 1946, the Little Rock Methodist Council, an interracial group of Methodist women, hired her to organize women's missionary organizations in Black Methodist churches. To train her, they paid her way to take a special summer course at Garrett Seminary in Evanston, Illinois, which she later described as eye-opening. So getting outside the South was really important. That same year, she graduated from Philander Smith with a degree in business administration. So she's working, again, that was on that slide, she's working for, that's a modern image of Philander Smith, blurry. She's working for this interracial group, the Little Rock Methodist Council, for almost 3 years, and while in that position, she helped to get Camp Aldersgate off the ground. Also on the Little Rock Council was Reverend James E. Major, who was the president of Philander Smith. He persuaded the board to locate and develop, that is the board of the interracial group, to locate and develop a rural site for summer recreation for Little Rock's Black children for whom no recreational facilities were available anywhere in the state at the time. So they secured a $25,000 grant, significant amount of money, from the Women's Division. With that money, acquired an abandoned turkey farm on 120 acres of land a few miles away from downtown Little Rock and built Camp Aldersgate. The local women's societies provided funds to hire a white director and several African-American assistants, of which Hoover was one. There were 2 young Black men who were hired to clean up the place and get buildings ready for human habitation. Both of those men went on to become Methodist pastors. For many years, it was the only place in Arkansas where white and Black people could safely meet. Though interracial gatherings created backlash, and the Little Rock Council, as well as local units of the WSCS. By the way, both white and Black units were supporting this. Again, the women's division of the Methodist Church was among the most progressive in that area of any Southern denomination. So they were both supporting this interracial effort. They got threats. They got death threats. There were drive-by threats and various threats to their life and health, but they were undeterred. Hoover said that Aldersgate was established, to quote, by a group of people who dared not accept the way it is as what must be, people who provided hope and a guide for future behavior. We were doing a bold thing, she remembered, bringing together people across the lines of race. Lay women are justifiably proud of their involvement with the camp in its origin and have continued to provide support during the myriad stages of change and development, which they still do. The Women's Division still owns that property, now probably worth millions of dollars, which continues to provide enough revenue to support the camp. All right, in 1948, here I'm just going to show you this this packed slide again, just so you can kind of keep track. But I promise you this will be the last time I'll put a slide of text up there for you. She went to work for the Women's Division of the Methodist Church as a field worker. She traveled to the then 48 states and territories, as well as India and Pakistan, speaking to local women's societies, pastors, schools, and colleges, doing leadership training and setting up new units. This required no small amount of courage, traveling by herself in Jim Crow America, a woman by herself in Jim Crow America. For example, she almost always stayed in the homes of Black Methodists, often the pastors, and I think you can guess why, because Black people couldn't find places to stay in much of white America. She couldn't be sure of finding lodging. It required sacrifices that none of the other women who worked for the Women's Division had to think about, said one of her co-workers in her obituary. So that was 48 to 58, 10 years. And then you can see in 58, she takes a new job, and this is when she will go up to New York City. In 1958, Thelma Stevens, who is sitting to Hoover's left, Thelma Stevens, who is director of the Department of Christian Social Relations, hired Hoover as a staff member of that department with offices in New York City. This made Hoover the first African-American professional at the Methodist Church Board of Missions to work among the general church membership and not just among Blacks. Always before this, they were hired to work with African-Americans. She packed her bags and moved to New York City, where she would live for the next 40 years. Encouraged by Stevens, she attended school at night, on leaves, and during the summer to earn an MA in education from NYU in 1962. Living in New York City exposed her to an entirely different culture and set of possibilities than she had encountered in the South. Just by the way, while I'm on that slide, the person to her right is a volunteer president of the organization. The volunteers serve terms of 4 years, Mrs. Bender, the current president at the time. And the volunteers were typically married. They were often married to pastors and would serve a term of 4 years typically. They might be reelected, but that was common. But the staff members like Hoover and Stevens were not married. That was common at the time because it was still really unusual for married women to have both a career and maintain a family because it took so much time away. Families took so much time away from the career. So the staff members at the time were really all single. I also checked the census for this. They often lived with each other, lived together. So staff members at the women's division had certain programs under their responsibility. One of hers was birth control, or they called it responsible parenthood, but also birth control. And I'll come back to that. Another was educating people on the role and mission of the United Nations. She took groups to UN headquarters to sit in on proceedings and held study seminars about its role. So needless to say, that's extremely mind-expanding too, eye-opening. It was so successful that the women's division floated a loan to build a 12-story bronze and glass structure to house the Church Center for the United Nations, which is on United Nations Plaza, which is still there and still used. It's ecumenical. In 1965, she moved up another rung into top leadership, becoming Assistant General Secretary of the Women's Division with responsibility for the section of Program and Education for Christian Missions, one of 3 major units of the Women's Division. The Northwest Arkansas Times covered that story, and I'm going to read you the headline. Be prepared to. Well, I don't know what to judge, how to judge your reaction, but the headline was, Fayetteville girl named to top Methodist staff position. She was 40 years old. Fayetteville girl. Well, at least they referred to her in the story as Miss Hoover, which is an advance because, typically they wouldn't even use that honorific for black people. It's really unusual for them to do. So they've progressed that much anyway. Finally, in 1968, as I mentioned, she was elected to the top staff position, Deputy General Secretary of the Women's Division of the General Board of Missions, where racial and gender equality were part of her mission. Methodist women's missionary organizations were, Hoover said, concerned with the development of their own potential, the welfare of their children and those of others throughout the world, the lack of respect in many societies for the single woman, and the high illiteracy rate among women. So you can see that's a very feminist mission. She believed in empowering lay women, the grassroots, again, partly because there's so few female clergy. There's a limit to what they can do, right? When you're 1 out of 1,000, right, your impact's going to be very limited. But 1.7 million lay women, that's a force. That's a force to be reckoned with, and that's who she wants to mobilize and worked hard to mobilize towards these progressive feminist goals. So at the time, being a lay woman through this organization, which was autonomous, was the most likely route to power and influence within Methodism. Said Garlinda Burton, Hoover let lay women, particularly women of color and women from small towns, know that they are the legs the church stand on and that position deserves respect. This is Mae Gray, who was from Kansas City, I believe, and that's someone that you can see she's pulling in women of color. She became a president while Hoover was the president. So again, elevating women of color to positions of prominence. In 1972, she gave an invited lecture at Harvard's Divinity School entitled Triple Jeopardy. While all women suffered oppression because of their gender, she told her audience, African American women also suffered because of their race. Today we call that intersectionality, is the fancy term for it, but at the time they didn't have that. While the third leg of oppression for black church women resided in the church. This lecture critiqued black male theology and control in black churches. Her 10 years spent crisscrossing the country as a field worker had taught Hoover that African American women were the glue that kept churches alive and afloat. Based on those strengths, Hoover argued that women of color should contest the assumptions of white church women as well as the power of black male clergy. Quoting, "The black church woman must come to the point of challenging both her sisters in other denominations and the clergy male hierarchy in her own, she has given the most, and in my judgment, gotten the least. Her foresight, ingenuity, and stick-to-itiveness have kept many black churches open, many black preachers fed, many parsonages livable. That was a pretty bold thing to say. Oppression was unjust no matter the sphere in which it operated, no matter the race or gender of the oppressor. She remained in that position at the head of that organization until 1990, as I mentioned, when at the age of 65, she retired after a couple of major surgeries with a record to be proud of. Under her command, there was never any hint of scandal, impropriety, misuse of funds, or abuse of power. How many organizations can say that? That would have been entirely contrary to her feminist ethics. And by the way, she never called herself a feminist. Some people who knew her told me. She didn't embrace labels. She didn't want to alienate her constituency either. She is essentially elected and also managed, or her employer effectively is the board itself, and she could easily be fired and easily be unelected, right? And so she's kind of walking a careful fine line, right, in terms of putting forward her philosophy and her mission, but at the same time not being so audacious as to cost herself the job, in which case you haven't really done yourself any favors, right? Her volunteer service included being a board member of the National Council of Churches, Church Women United, the World Council of Churches, the National Council of Negro Women. These are all major national organizations. And the Board of Trustees of Payne College, which is another Methodist-supported HBCU. As chair of the YWCA's National Public Affairs Committee from 64 to 67, she helped to prick its conscience on the issues of war and peace, civil rights, and economic and social justice. She was a founding member of Black Methodists for Church Renewal, no small achievement there either, and persuaded the Women's Division to support that organization to the tune of tens of thousands of dollars annually. She, along with Dorothy Height, president of the NCNW, who was her friend and another Methodist, National Council of Negro Women, led the YWCA's Task Force on Racial Justice. She and Height saw through to completion the project to erect a monument to Mary McLeod Bethune, who was another Methodist. Did y'all know that? Bethune was also supported by the Women's Division. Not initially, but eventually she got, which is one reason they do this. Eventually the Women's Division began to contribute to Bethune's college and Bethune's mission. Anyway, so while Hoover was the head of this, they managed to get this statue erected, and she doesn't spearhead this because the drive to raise the money to put that statue up in Washington, D.C. had been going on for years and years and years and years and years, and they had just had trouble getting the money to finally do it, and so she got the Women's Division to contribute the money to put it over the top, to put it up there in Lincoln Park, Washington, D.C. Okay, so some of her achievements as head of the, I'll come back to that in just a second. I don't want to distract you while I'm going through. Some of her achievements as CEO of the Women's Division. Okay, so let me run through these. That's by way of introduction. Her location in New York City, a feminist hotspot where many influential second-wave women's liberationists lived, proved energizing. As she wrote in her one little book that she wrote with Unveiled Face, the Women's Division, I'm quoting from that, understood at once what the secular feminists were struggling with and in revolt against. These intelligent, angry, younger women articulated our frustration also. Clearly, she's talking about frustration with the male-dominated church itself, right? Their analysis deepened our understanding of the systemic oppression of women. Their determination to revise patriarchal culture and politics energized us. So likewise, she encouraged units of UMW, which is all over the country, to adopt, well, actually it's international, to adopt many of the movement strategies such as consciousness-raising groups. Basically, UMW meetings became consciousness-raising meetings in which women tried to understand themselves within a male-dominated church and society. With Theressa Hoover at the helm, the Women's Division supported the goals of second-wave feminism, including reproductive rights, the Equal Rights Amendment I mentioned earlier. It pushed for and got a general commission on the status and role of women, and also conference-based ones. That's the administrative unit of the Methodist Church around the country. The North Arkansas Conference established one in 1974 to see that women were adequately represented on boards and in pulpits, to create a favorable climate of opinion for female clergy appointments, and so forth. They pushed for visibility for women, offered training for leadership, monitored the status of women at conferences, and reported back how many women were elected or appointed as delegates and to boards. They pushed forward the names of women when appointments were made, tried to ensure that women attended the annual conferences, and also ensured child care was available, and that they were heard and not talked over, which was a constant battle. Under her leadership, the Women's Division organized and funded a committee on women's concerns. It funded groups around the country to plan women's studies curricula in seminaries, women's centers, child care and other aids to women's students, abortion counseling services, which meant assisting women who were seeking abortions, domestic violence shelters, and teams that worked to transform masculinist theological understandings and bureaucracies. Oops, I thought that was mine. I was about to scold myself. Okay. So on that note, and I will go ahead and let you read while I'm talking about this, the purpose of United Methodist Women. Thanks to Hoover, the Women's Division became a founding member and the only religious group on the board of directors of ERA America, the umbrella organization for all national organizations working for ERA. Response Magazine, which was the official organ of the UMW, regularly carried articles educating readers on how they might persuade their legislators to vote in support of the amendment. So you see, it's not just philosophical. You have to put it into action. And here's a checklist for how you could do that, okay? You need a model letter, here's a model letter. Think about taking this and finding out who your legislators are, which by itself is an important thing to do. Let's find out who your representatives are. Most people don't actually know that. Get their addresses, we can help you with this, and let's send a letter to them. So that's actually how I stumbled on this topic. People often ask me that. How did you? Well, my last book, as you mentioned in the introduction, was on second wave feminism in Louisiana. Usually when I tell people I wrote a book on feminism in Louisiana, they say that it has to be a little book, right? A small book, a thin book. It's actually not, it's quite fat. But that's how I came across these Methodists. And I had no idea when I began doing the research on this, on second wave feminism in Louisiana, post-war feminism, post-World War II. And all of a sudden I was like, oh my God, these are Methodist. In all these, League of Women Voters, or you name it, League of Women Voters, just all these, the names on the letters, they'll put UMW on there a lot of times. What is going on? I had no idea. Come to find out it was Theressa Hoover. So that's how I traced back to her and began to follow. I was like, there is something going on here that people do not know about, even me. And that's my field. I do feminism. That's what I do. I do the history of feminism. I had no idea about any of this. That's, again, partly because, well, there's lots of reasons for that, because I can talk about historiography forever, too, which you don't want me to do that. But it's also partly because black women just don't get a lot of recognition. I mean, they tend to get whitewashed. And so, again, I'm on a mission to change that as well. All right, so they're very active on all of these things. The Methodist Church, as I mentioned before, was one of the first to do that. All of your values have to be put into action, as she reminded readers. Christian values are not important when they are only held. They must be also expressed in all aspects of our life. And many of these stands were controversial. They were controversial then. They're controversial, continue to be today, including the hotly debated issue of women's access to fertility, family planning resources, and legal abortion. But as I mentioned, the Methodist Church actually went on record, and I'm talking about not just the women's division, the church itself. General Conference went on record in 1968. So Roe v. Wade was 1973. So in 1968, they went on record in support of liberalization of abortion laws in the United States as a pro-woman feminist measure. All right, now let me give you a little bit of the background on the theology behind that, the feminist theology behind that. Christian feminists like Hoover, and of course she read widely in theology as well, and everything else. She started the day, every day, she said, with a Bible in her hand and the New York Times. So she kept up with the news, she kept up with and she's always quoting from things that she's reading. But the theology. Christian feminists reconfigured the male-defined view of women as the weaker vessel who, through the sin of Eve, was responsible for humans' fall from grace. That's the older view. They sought a desacralization of women's power to reproduce and to remove biology from the equation altogether. Women need not be biological mothers for their lives to have value in the eyes of God, they insisted, and certainly God's gift of salvation was not dependent on parenthood. After all, nuns had proven that centuries before. And if you think about it, Hoover and many of the Methodist staff women she worked with in New York are effectively sort of living that kind of a life, a nun's life. They chose not to marry, they chose not to have children, but that should not make them any less worthy of God's praise and acceptance. Hoover believed she could do God's work actually more effectively by nurturing large numbers of children and mothers through the vehicle of the church rather than by having biological children of her own. To feminist Methodists, quality of life was more important than quantity. Controlling reproduction allowed women the space to choose to become mothers to society or to advance their own careers. So quality of life. So it's a different value system, effectively. Okay, and following the legalization of abortion in 1973, the Women's Division became a founding member of the Religious Coalition of Abortion Rights, RCAR, a national body today known as the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. Representing that group, Hoover testified before a House subcommittee in 1976 about why mainline Protestant and Jewish groups opposed a constitutional amendment to prohibit abortion. So, of course, this is an issue about which reasonable people and equally devout people can disagree, right? So that's just a sampling of the many things that UMW did during her tenure in office. Upon her retirement, when asked what she considered her greatest achievement, she said it was to have kept the Women's Division reasonably autonomous and in control of its own resources. They did lose some control to the General Board in a reorganization that happened in 1964, which is before she took over, but they never lost control of their assets, and that makes them unusual among Protestant denominations, where in every other Protestant denomination, the women eventually lost all of that to the General Church. The men took them over. There was a co-optation that went on. So if we had not remained in control of our autonomy and finances, most of our work with women and children around the world would not be in existence today. The church that was named after her, which I went down and talked with the person, that's Deborah Bell right there, who is the pastor of that church. I made a trip to Little Rock to visit the church and to talk with her and the person who founded that church, who is her father, Bill Robinson Jr., who served as its pastor for 32 years. He had known Theressa when she was a community worker in Little Rock, because remember, she was at Philander Smith and she was hired out of there. He said he'd known her since he was in short pants. He remembered her and Marshall, the person who was the deaconess that she worked with at Aldersgate, putting together Camp Aldersgate. He and Clark Preston were the two young men I mentioned who cleaned out the turkey houses and helped to rehab the facility to make them habitable. They both went on to become Methodist pastors, and he went on to name a church after her. He said Theressa helped get the WSCS, that's what it was then, started in this little Methodist church. Well, sorry, I'm backing up a little bit. Theressa helped get the WSCS started in the little Methodist church that he attended at the time, so when he was a child. His mother had died when he was 11, and the other women in the WSCS took over mothering him. I don't believe I would be here today if it hadn't been for her, Bill says fondly of Theressa. Theressa helped the WSCS women learn to do social justice and service work in the community. So when Reverend Robinson bought this church from the old congregation for $1, it's in a white flight area where whites had moved out as a result of desegregation in the schools, and they had to camp to the suburbs. He managed to persuade them to sell it to him for $1, and then he asked Theressa if he could name it after her. She said yes, but under 3 circumstances. You must have a UMW. You have to be in mission to the community. These were all parts of her mission. And don't ask me for money. He said, in the end, she gave us plenty of money anyway, but we didn't have to ask for it. A couple of her family members were also members of this church. He of course, upheld all of this. The Community Development Foundation he started is called Better Community Development, Inc., and it is still going strong. I met him there. I'm sorry I didn't take his picture. And it built 125 new homes in the community with help from local money and HUD money. It supports projects for women, children, and youth, right up her alley, and started a certified faith-based licensed substance abuse program. With the help of the city, it got a bank to locate across the street because, of course, banks will not locate in minority neighborhoods, and a police substation. Also, Philander Smith has a social justice center. They helped to get that started in there. They work with them as well. So again, that's exactly the kind of thing that Hoover urged on the faithful. So he and his daughter now preside over that church. This is, again, just for reference, this is before the UMW, the mission of the Women's Missionary Societies, before, just by way of the history, so you can see that the mission sort of evolves, but what the Theressa Hoover Church is doing is just firmly in keeping with this longstanding mission. As I mentioned, his daughter provides over both of those now, the church and the BCI, and I interviewed her as well, because she knew Hoover as well. She said Hoover identified, inspired, motivated, taught, modeled, and empowered young women. She did that for me. She spoke boldly, and watching her gave me courage to do likewise, to speak out against injustice. She was very witty. She could reprimand you or correct you, but you'd be okay with it. She didn't belittle you. I was nominated to serve as an officer on the conference level of UMW, and I never would have done that without her pushing me to do it. She had a great spirit about her, and that's the end of that quote. And that's a legacy I would like people to know more about. So I'm going to show you that last slide. Again, how the purpose evolved there. Needless to say, they're kind of constantly revising it, but the main focus of it remains the same, as you can expect, to assist women and children in particular around the world. But also notice I bolded improve civic, community, and world conditions. One reason these women were so different is because they did a lot of self-study, not self-study, they did do self-study, but that's not what I was trying to say. They did a lot of book groups, basically study groups, in which they had a reading program that the Women's Division helped to develop for them, and they can choose from the list. That's still true today. And then they would get together on a regular basis and after having read the books, discuss the books and ways in which they could put that philosophy into action. So it was always a continuous education, and it was extremely mind-expanding, and it's non-parochial. It looks beyond the local church, the local community, individual salvation, but ways in which we can remake the world, right? And that is what distinguishes them. And that continuous lifelong learning is also what gave them that really broad outlook. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying everybody was like her. She was unusual. Not every person who was a member of the UMW was an anti-racist. Not everybody agreed with all of this. That is, it's a 1.7 million member organization at the time. Its numbers have declined. But needless to say, they're not all going to agree. But the women who stayed with it, typically they're going to find some part of that program that's going to appeal to them and work, at least in some way, shape, or form, on that mission in the community. So we have her to thank for that. So that's where I'll quit, because I promised I would quit within about 45 minutes and give you guys time for questions. So I'll open it up. Anything else I have on here? I'm trying to remember. No, end of slide presentation. Yes.
You mentioned that she attended high school in Texas. Do you remember which town it was?
I have that written down, but I'm afraid if I say it, I might say the wrong town. Does anyone know offhand? I want to say Victoria, but I could be wrong about that. I don't have it in my notes right here, but I do know. Yes.
Did some of her siblings then get bused to Fort Smith? Because that's where
Yes.
most of the kids went to high
Yes,
school.
that's right. That's now I don't know. I just know that she and 3 of her siblings, which would be most of them, went to live with the aunt
Oh, okay.
in Texas, as did several other people who she went to school with. That is from Fayetteville. And maybe by the time the youngest one had gotten up there, Fayetteville had desegregated its schools. I don't know if you knew this, but Fayetteville was the first in the state to desegregate schools. Yeah.
Not a native, but I was proud of that.
Well, and it was partly because it was less expensive, and it also was a very small black population here, so it was less, I don't know, disturbing, caused less of a disturbance, I guess.
Is there any signage on the house that she grew up in?
It doesn't exist anymore. It's in the historically black neighborhood. Do you happen to know? Are you?
No, I was saying that's what, I mean, because there's so much being lost,
Yeah.
that's why they're really trying to make that
A historic neighborhood, right, yeah. So I'm hoping that, hopefully this will all go through, you know, it's before the city council right now, sort of hoping Emma might be here today.
The Hoover house itself is gone.
Yes, the Hoover House itself is gone, but I'm hoping that we can work together to get some commemorative plaque somewhere appropriate for her. Maybe near St. James, which would also be appropriate. St. James Methodist. I have to be sure to say that because when I think St. James, I always think Methodist, but there's a St. James Baptist. And usually when I say that without putting Methodist, people think Baptist, so I have to remember to clarify that. Any other questions about any of that? Are y'all shy, or did I answer everything? Sure.
When you're doing your research, did you talk to Dr. Margaret Clark by any chance?
I have been on the phone with her, and I'm trying to get a meeting in person with her, and I have not been successful.
Great resource there.
She keeps telling me she doesn't know anything.
By that.
I'm trying. If you can persuade her, I've had several people try to persuade her to talk with me, and I have had a little trouble. Let me just say, maybe because of my race, jumping over the barrier, color line.
Margaret's the most inclusive person I've ever known, so I know.
She will not talk with me. That's all I can say. And if you can make that happen, I'll be happy to give you my card. So I've tried multiple times, actually. Oh, I'm sorry. That was my timer to tell me to shut up. She was nice, but she just told me she didn't have anything to tell me.
I thought she was a personal friend.
She was. Yeah, go ahead.
Just want to speak on behalf.
Sure.
I just want to say, guys, thank you for what you have done. I am the great grand of the nephew.
Okay.
This Raven, my wife, is Theressa Hoover's niece.
Okay.
So the house that y'all was talking about, there's a lot of stuff that happened within the city that caused them the property to be disposed of. That's why the house is torn
Ooh,
down.
I'd like to hear that too.
That they rebuilding in South Fayetteville, where she grew up at. There's a lot of questions. My wife, she would be here to answer a lot of stuff
Okay.
that you're trying to get answered to, but about her youth when she was growing up.
Oh, I would love
But me and Raven, this is another descendant of her.
Descendant, yes.
So it's just that we wanted to step in and represent the family.
Oh, I appreciate it.
But to answer your question, I can get you all the information that you need to
Thank you.
continue your journey on this here.
Yay, success. I really appreciate that because needless to say, as a historian, I want to be accurate. So I want to fill in a lot of gaps that I have, especially about her life in Fayetteville. Her public record, you know, when she was a public figure, there's lots written about it. So I can do that easily. But it's the more private things that I don't know anything about. So be happy. If I had personal papers, which I don't, I've never located personal papers of hers, I could write a full-length biography. I think she deserves it. Dorothy Height has a full-length biography. She doesn't have one, and I would love to do that, but I need information from people like you guys.
I will have all the,
Yay. Okay, exulting on the inside. Thank you so much. And what is your name, if you don't mind?
My name is Jermaine Petty.
Okay.
So my name is Jermaine Petty. I'm from South Carolina. Come to school here at the University of Arkansas, and I ran into Melinda, who is now my wife. Her name at the time was Melinda Pope at the time.
Yep,
Her
I came across it in the census,
Her,
yep.
her mother name was Patricia
Mm-hmm.
Pope, Melba Smith.
Melba Smith, yep.
So, we have the history of Theressa Hoover, but like I said, I'm outside, married into the family. So,
Okay. Well, I was really hoping to connect with one of the relatives, so I'm very pleased. Great.
Melinda is here in Arkansas, she's the last living relative of Theressa Hoover. And then you have Dolly Hoover, who's in New York.
Okay, and I'll give you a card when I'm done. Great, thank you so much. That's well worth it. Anyone else? I'm so glad you spoke up. All right, well, I suppose if no one has anything else, I'll close it down. And feel free to come and speak with me. Thank you again. Okay. Do you want to cut the mic so I...